here we've done it. We've reached the end of the road for the Crusades. And the title of this particular session is The End of the Crusader Kingdoms. It's quite a nice cover image, lots of blue sky, which indicates that the future is open, etc. However, that man on the right, he's a bit problematic. Does anyone recognise him? We agree that the man is Genghis Khan. That's the one. I believe about half the Mongolian population is descended from him, isn't it? I would say that he was rather a busy man. However, we also need to bear in mind that all the people he murdered, all 50 million of them, didn't leave much in the way of a genetic footprint, so all the people in Asia had to come from somewhere. A man of great significance, and a man who I think had a great deal of influence over the manner in which the Crusader Kingdoms ended, and over the possibility of further crusades. It's not something I'd considered until last night, so I'm still thinking my way towards it, but it does strike me as increasingly likely. Let's have a look at this. And one of the things that we always need to consider is perspective. If you look at things from one point in time, they look very different from how they look seen from another point in time. For example, if you look back at the Second World War from today, you see it in one particular way. If you look back at it from 1960, you'll see it in a very different way. The reason is because people live and die through time. In 1960, anyone who looked back at the Second World War was seeing it as contemporary history. Well, everybody under the age of 30 had not only lived through it, but been fully aware of it. And people were still walking around in perfectly good health, doing middle ranking and senior jobs, who'd fought in the thing. Whereas nowadays, finding someone who fought in the Second World War is very difficult, and finding anyone who remembers the Second World War is becoming rather difficult, which means that we see it in a different way. And again, if you transfer this to the Crusades, in 1099, in 1120, in 1130 even, you can see the Franks as intruders. They have burst into the Levant. They don't know the languages. They speak languages that are themselves incomprehensible. They have strange social customs, and they have no understanding of the local ways. There is a degree of amusement at how the Franks behave when exposed to local customs, bathing, eating customs, and all the rest of it. So you can see, for the first generation or so, you can see the Frank estates as intruders. They came, and they might, perhaps, God willing, be made to go away again. By about 1200, though, 100 years after the fall of Jerusalem, the Franks have been in the region for 100 years. There is a continuing influx of immigrants from France and some of the less advanced areas of Italy, let's say, and certainly from Germany and from England. There is an influx, a continuing influx of immigrants who have no understanding of local ways, who don't even understand the local weather, so they get the skins burned off their backs every so often. But there is a solid majority in the Crusader Kingdoms who not only have lived there for a long time, but have lived there for the whole of their lives, who have been born there. I'm not saying that the Franks in the Holy Land went native, though in a large sense they did. They remained Franks. They remained Roman Catholic Christians. But at the same time, they adapted themselves so far as they found convenient to the local circumstances, and they became aware of local circumstances in ways that the earliest Franks were not. And I've given three names here. Amalric I of Jerusalem, he's the last really effective king of Jerusalem. He was born in Jerusalem, died in Jerusalem. Well, didn't die in Jerusalem, he died, I think, in Egypt. I can't remember, though. He died of dysentery or something, as one does. But born in Jerusalem, married to Maria Comnena, a granddaughter, I think, of Manuel Comnenus. He wore Eastern clothes, he used Eastern doctors, he ate Eastern food. He was fully integrated into the diplomatic machinery of the Levant. And then you have William of Tyre, Archbishop, Chancellor of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Again, he was born in the Holy Land. I don't think he was born in Jerusalem. He was born in Acre or somewhere. But he was fluent in Latin, Greek and Arabic. He was fully aware of what was going on in Damascus and even in Baghdad. He was a Frank in the sense that his native language may have been a dialect of French. He was a Roman Catholic, obviously, but if you had moved him to Paris, where he lived for some of his life, if you'd moved him to Paris, he would have felt a bit of an outsider. He was certainly at his happiest when he was living in the land of his birth, which is the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Or we have Reginald of Sidon. He was born in the Holy Land, and he was fluent in Arabic and an expert on Arab literature, and he was very useful in the Third Crusade as a go-between for Richard and Saladin. And then you have all of the thousands and tens of thousands of other Franks, many of whom had settled into the point where if you saw them in the street, you might see that their hair was a bit lighter than other people's, but that's not necessarily the case because the Holy Land's always been rather mixed ethnically. You might say, that's a Frank, I can tell by the colour of his eyes or the shade of his hair. But if you looked at him from behind as he walked past, you'd think, there goes somebody who's rather well off, and that's it. The Franks are increasingly indistinguishable from, I won't call them the natives, from people whose roots in that region go back somewhat further. By 1200, the Franks have integrated themselves into the society of the region. I'm not saying that it was any kind of multicultural love feast. They were all quite capable of killing each other or otherwise persecuting each other, doing the most awful things to each other, but I'm afraid that's what happens in such places. But the Franks were no longer seen as interlopers. They're not seen as, what are they doing here? Who brought them here? How did he get here? It's no longer a question of that. The Franks they're regarded as a nuisance, but an irremovable nuisance, because every time you try to remove them, their friends in Europe turn up and keep them there. Also, they are rather good at fighting and hanging on by their fingernails. So the Franks are an irremovable nuisance, and although when we look at the Crusades, we tend to look at the high points, the Battle of Hattin, the Siege of Jerusalem, the Siege of Antioch, the various battles. And if you do a search on the internet for images about the Crusades, for the most part, all you'll find is images of fighting and death. But despite that, the fighting and dying part of it only takes up a very small minority of the history of the Frankish Crusader states. For the most part, I'll say again, the Franks were regarded by their neighbours as an irremovable nuisance with whom coexistence was the normal state of affairs. And yet, 100 years later, by 1291, the Franks were all gone, and they never came back. There was no crusade that would replace them in the cities from which they had been dislodged. Indeed, there were no cities where they clung on. There was nothing like Tyre, or Antioch or any of the other places that didn't fall to Saladin in 1187. This time it was a clean sweep, and the Franks did not come back, and they were not able to come back. I could, if I wanted to take a very traditional view of the 13th century, start with the Children's Crusade, which went absolutely nowhere, or rather, many of the children appear to have ended up in the Alexandrian slave markets. And then I could have looked at the Fifth Crusade, which again doesn't do very much, and the Sixth Crusade. I have to look at that because it's the last hurrah of traditional crusading. And then you have the Seventh Crusade and all the others. But I don't really want to cover those crusades. The sixth I have to talk about, but the fifth and the seventh, no, because I don't think they're that important. Let's talk about the economy. How did the Franks live? What were circumstances like in the Crusader Kingdoms? And the answer is that they were unusually prosperous so far as we can tell. Around 1175, for reasons that nobody has satisfactorily explained, the eastern trade begins to shift from Alexandria towards Damascus. I don't know why. Maybe some change in the monsoon or something. But whereas in about 1100, Eastern spices, Eastern silk, Eastern luxury goods of all kind had come up the Red Sea towards Alexandria, or they'd gone through the Black Sea towards Constantinople. By about 1175 and after that, the overland route to Damascus appears to be the route of choice. Damascus is an inland city, so it needs an outlet onto the Mediterranean, which means the Crusader city-states, Tyre, Acre, Ascalon, and all those other places, Sidon, Haifa, Jaffa. Then again, Haifa and Jaffa, are they the same? They possibly are. All of these are controlled by the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They are part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which means that the Kingdom of Jerusalem is a very important point of contact. It is the greatest market in the Eastern Mediterranean. Indeed, if we look at a map of the Crusader Kingdoms, let me find one. There you are. There's a map of the Crusader states. They are somewhat reduced from what they had been before 1187. But you must bear in mind that much of the territory lost is rather arid. It's not particularly useful. Don't compare the territory of modern Israel, which is rather well watered and green, with the territory as it would have been 800 or 900 years ago. A lot of the territory covered by the Kingdom of Jerusalem before 1187 was desert, whereas the Second Kingdom of Jerusalem, the one that kept its capital at Acre, that is hugging the coast, that gets fairly constant rainfall, and it's much more fertile than the hinterland. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is rich and prosperous from trade, but it's also very rich agricultural land, and there is a great deal of evidence showing that it was also rich in a rather minor pre-modern way from manufacturing. That there seem to have been workshops manufacturing glassware, metal goods, fabrics, leatherware, wood, and moving sugar around. And don't forget that attached to the Kingdom of Jerusalem at this time was also the island of Cyprus, which is very rich. So the Kingdom of Jerusalem it's not an armed camp filled with Franks going about in full suits of armour, living from feudal rents. It is a highly commercial society. The coastal cities are filled with Genoese and Venetian merchants. They're filled with Oriental merchants of all kinds. Vast amounts of produce moves backwards and forwards, and the territory itself is rather rich and productive in terms of agriculture and manufacturing. We're not talking about economically depressed fortress states. We are talking about a very rich area in the Levant. A comment on the importance of the Levantine coastal cities. They were important all the way through to the end of the 13th century when, for reasons that I'll explain, they suddenly ceased to be important all at the same time, and they remain unimportant for several centuries afterwards. Although climate has a tendency to wobble upwards and downwards, these are wobbles, not radical swings, and the circumstances of the Levant in 1200 AD were not radically different from those of the Levant 1200 BC. The reasons why these coastal cities should be rich continued all the way through. Now, let's have a look at the last real crusade. There's Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, an interesting man in his own right. He was born in Sicily. He grew up there, and because Sicily in those days was a multicultural and multi-religious area, Frederick grew up, being a clever young man, fluent in Arabic, French, German, Greek, Italian and Latin. He appears to have been rather sceptical about religion, and certainly, as long as you didn't get on his bad side, rather tolerant of religious dissent. That didn't mean that he was particularly liberal in political matters. He was the one in charge, and he planned to stay in charge. At the age of 26, having intrigued for this position for several years, he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. One of his promises before he becomes emperor is that he will lead a crusade, as one does. It's rather like a beauty competition. Hello, and what is your ambition? I want to work with handicapped children and contribute in a measurable sense to world peace. Oh, isn't that nice? If you're canvassing people to get their votes as Holy Roman Emperor, you say, I want to lead a crusade and take back Jerusalem from the infidel. So he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. The Pope at the time of his coronation is a friend or a political ally. It amounts to the same thing. And he's not terribly interested in collecting on that promise. However, Pope Eugenius dies eventually and is replaced by Pope Gregory the Ninth. Gregory the Ninth doesn't like Frederick for political reasons because they're fighting over who will dominate central Italy. The Pope would find it very convenient if Frederick could be packed off to the Holy Land. You never know, he might catch something and die. So the Pope puts extreme pressure on Frederick. Go on, you've got to go off to the Holy Land. I have a promise here. You've promised to go off on a crusade. Well, I'm sending you on a crusade. But at last Frederick does set off. He has good reason for going, to be honest, because he is married to the daughter of the King of Jerusalem, and his son is the heir to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, so he does have a duty to go and protect the place. But at last, in 1125, Gregory the Ninth gets Frederick to go off on his crusade. Frederick sets off with a large fleet, but then on a stopover they all get malaria, and Frederick insists on an immediate return to Italy. The Pope uses this as an excuse. The Pope may be angry, but fleets are delayed for all sorts of reasons, and malaria sounds like rather a good reason. Gregory takes against Frederick for his sudden return to Italy and excommunicates him. This doesn't seem to slow Frederick down at all. he sets off again on the crusade, and although there's no law against doing so, it is a little presumptuous to continue on a crusade after you've been excommunicated. But then again, it didn't seem to stop the projectors of the Fourth Crusade. Remember, the Pope handed out blanket excommunications, and they carried on regardless, all the way to Constantinople. Well, Frederick has been excommunicated. He continues on his way across the Mediterranean. He arrives in Acre in 1228, where he is promptly excommunicated again, because he's going on a crusade while already excommunicated. Now, I'm not sure what a double excommunication does. If you're excommunicated, it means you're outside the church and you will surely go to hell. What does a double excommunication do? Does it put you back into the church? Does it put you into a deeper circle of hell? I don't know, but the Pope was angry with Frederick, so while Frederick was off in the Holy Land, the Pope did him another excommunication just to make sure. This makes Frederick's time in the Holy Land difficult. Some of the locals are inclined to follow him because he is a man of great ability, and if anyone can take Jerusalem back, it will be Frederick, but others are mindful of a double excommunication and Frederick's imperious nature, and they prefer to stay aloof. Bearing in mind the situation when Richard and Saladin agreed their long truce was that the Crusaders kept all the cities on the coast, but they only had visiting rights for Jerusalem, and bearing in mind that this was regarded as an interim and an undesirable state of affairs, Frederick is the most likely person to give them back Jerusalem. But because he is under a double excommunication, whatever that means, it means that many people in the Holy Land will not give Frederick their full support. But with a largely German army, Frederick advances on Jerusalem in the hope that something will turn up. And something does turn up. The Sultan al-Kamil, the Sultan of Egypt and the main Islamic ruler in the region, he enters into, or he accepts, secret negotiations with Frederick. Frederick doesn't actually want to fight a battle. He's willing to make a big noise, but he doesn't want to fight a battle because he's outnumbered. And Al-Kamil, he doesn't want to fight a battle either. He doesn't want to fight a war because there's always a chance that the Franks will win. They do tend to win battles more often than they lose them. And his own position is rather shaky as Sultan of Egypt. His hold over Syria is not very secure, and he's being troubled on his eastern borders by the Turks and by the Mongols. Let's keep an ear out. Let's keep an eye out for the Mongols. But Al-Kamil doesn't want to fight another war with another crusade. And as I said, Frederick doesn't want a war. Neither of them wants a war. And so on the 18th of February 2029, the agreement is signed. Frederick is given Jerusalem, Nazareth, Sidon, Jaffa and Bethlehem. In return, the Muslims have full visiting rights there. He's given these for 10 years, but there is a strong chance that the truce will continue far beyond that time. And you can see on the right, there is a map of the Kingdom of Jerusalem with two colours on it. You've got the dark orangey colour, which shows the kingdom's borders as they were around 1229, and then you've got the brighter pinky areas, which show the borders as of 1241. What Frederick has done is to expand the Kingdom of Jerusalem to very nearly what it had been in the time of Amalric II, many years earlier. And he's done so without fighting a battle. And fair's fair. the Muslims have full visiting rights, but that's it. You would expect that everybody would look at this deal and say, oh, that's nice, isn't it? But no. No, the whole Christian and Islamic world unites in outrage. There is a joint explosion going through the whole of Europe and the Levant. How dare Frederick make this agreement with the infidel? How dare Al-Kamil make this agreement with the infidel? It seems that both sides wanted more than they could easily get. The kind of smooth diplomatic compromise between these two rulers was a disappointment. I suppose if you're a knight, you've gone out to the Holy Land to fight on a crusade, it is disappointing to be told, oh, stand down, the whole thing's over, this is the deal. But that is the deal. Frederick now advances to Jerusalem, which is his city. He enters it. And he's taken on a tour of the holy places, Christian as well as Muslim. Indeed, he goes into one of the Islamic holy places, and a Christian monk follows him in. Frederick turns, pushes the man out, and makes it clear to everyone that if any other Christian dares violate the sanctity of an Islamic holy place, he will be put to death. Frederick himself is an exception because, well, he's an emperor. Although he doesn't have the right to do so because it requires the consent of the High Court, now in Acre, and he does have a son who has a much better title, Frederick decides that he should now be the king of Jerusalem. His problem is that he can't find any priest who'll put the crown on his head. So, on the 18th of March 2029, Frederick holds a coronation ceremony in Jerusalem and puts the crown on his head himself, a bit like Napoleon. The next day, the day after the coronation, a message turns up from Acre. The patriarch and the papal legate has put Jerusalem itself under an interdict. No church service, no functions of the church can be performed in Jerusalem until the Pope relents and orders the interdict to be lifted. At this point, Frederick hears that he has troubles in both Germany and Italy. He's been packed off to the Holy Land, or he's been strong-armed out to the Holy Land so that the Pope can make trouble for him in his European domains. Frederick now decides that it's time to leave. Mission is accomplished. Jerusalem is taken. There you are. He's done what Richard I couldn't do. He's done what no one else could do. He's reversed the Battle of Hattin, and again without striking a blow. He proceeds back to Acre, but he finds that he doesn't get a very good reception there. He embarks from Acre under a rain of excrement and rotting offal thrown by the outraged inhabitants, because although he's given them Jerusalem, although he's given them a lot, he hasn't given them what they expected and what they wanted. This is not the end of the Crusades. There was a Seventh Crusade. There was an Eighth Crusade. It depends how you measure these things. But this was the last successful one, and this is the last reasonable crusade. I talk about reasonable crusades. Remember when we spoke about the First Crusade, it was just some giant sea of blood. But if you look at these people by today's standards, both sides are absolutely monstrous. When the Christians broke into Jerusalem, they killed tens of thousands of people, or thousands of people at the very least. They themselves said that the streets ran with blood. And although fair's fair, although Saladin did not carry out a massacre on that scale when he retook Jerusalem, he was by no means liberal when it came to fallen cities elsewhere in the region. He was quite capable of putting unarmed civilians to the sword along with everybody else. The treatment of prisoners of war on each side was often less than we might think desirable. But at the top, you have a recognition that you're dealing with a civilized enemy who can be reasoned with and who can make deals that he will keep. And below the leaders, although you might be prepared to kill each other on the field of battle and feel no compunction about doing it, you will often go to marriage feasts on the other side and have a thoroughly good time. It is not a multicultural love feast in the Levant. It certainly is not that. But it is a relatively normal state of affairs in which both sides, for the most part, are not at war and where they can coexist. But after Frederick II goes home in 1229, circumstances change, and they change in a way that makes further coexistence impossible. And here it is, the Mongols. I think we all know who they were. Genghis Khan, the greatest mass murderer in history. He apparently killed about 11% of the human population. I read in a newspaper a few years ago that he killed so many people that he actually altered the carbon balance on the planet and changed the weather for a few years. I'm sure that is an exaggeration, and I don't know about the 11% either, but he did kill a very large number of people. And look at the size of their empire. It is much of the Eurasian landmass. It projects deep into Europe. That's the Ukraine, isn't it? Or is it Poland? It's the Ukraine and Poland. At one point, a Mongol raiding party got as far as the Adriatic, where they were chasing the king of Hungary. These people expanded very fast, a long way. And what makes them particularly notable is not necessarily that they built a large empire, which lasted a while and then fell to pieces. What makes them particularly notable is their manner of conquest. I've said that the Levant, as divided between the Franks and the various Islamic powers, was not, and I repeat, a multicultural love feast. But there was a possibility of cooperation, and the bloodshed was an occasional thing. Whereas the Mongols used terror as a deliberate policy. They would turn up in a new territory and call on people to surrender. If people surrendered, they would be treated with moderate regard. They wouldn't be robbed, they wouldn't be murdered. They might be told, right, you're resettling 2,000 miles to the east, so come on, be off with you. And being resettled like that is a pretty awful thing to be invited to do. But they would not kill you if you surrendered, if you gave full submission. If you didn't give full submission, these people would turn very nasty. They would round up large numbers of common people, peasants from the fields, travellers on journeys, people like that. And they might murder them, or they might use them as human shields. Once the Mongols took against you, they would not try to conquer you, they would hope to obliterate you. And their way with captured cities was deeply unpleasant. For example, in the 13th century, the Mongols took Moscow. According to the story I read, they put the entire surviving population of Moscow, thousands of people, they made them lie on the ground, they covered them with boards, and they then spent the whole night dancing on top of those boards until most of the surviving population of Moscow was smashed to pulp. The big one, however, was Baghdad. There is a fairly modern representation of Baghdad. It was established after about 750 by the Abbasids. It's on the river Tigris. It's a very good trading position. It's not far from Babylon. Oh, but we all know where Baghdad is, obviously. It fell to the Americans in 2003, so Baghdad is Baghdad, and it's where Baghdad is. Founded 750. Over the past 500 years, let's say, it has become both very rich and very large, and part of its wealth is the vast libraries that are gathered there. This is the centre of Islamic scholarship. It is the centre of Islamic civilization. The Caliph lives there. The Caliph himself is no longer a man of any particular importance, but he is the Caliph. He is the direct successor institutionally of the Prophet, and everyone is supposed to look to him in principle, though not perhaps in everyday matters. But it is a wealthy, it is an educated, it is an immensely civilized city. It may have a population of 1 million. The Arabic writers say it had a population of that. May have had, it's hard to say, but it has a very large population. The Mongols turn up outside and call on the inhabitants to surrender. The Caliph says, "No, we're not surrendering to you. Our walls are completely impenetrable. There's no way through them, and you can stay outside until you starve, and then you can go away with your tails between your legs." But the Mongols, they don't go away. They lay siege to Baghdad for a month, while a troop of Chinese engineers pelts the walls with various missiles until the walls fall down. The Mongols then step inside the city. The Caliph sends a messenger. "We surrender. We have at last surrendered." But it is rather late, even against a civilized enemy. Once the enemy has forced his way into the city, he has a choice whether to accept the surrender or whether to put the city to the sword. The Mongols, their behaviour is rather strange. For 3 days after the surrender, they remain in their camp outside the city walls. And then they march in and they start a massacre. This is not a question of blood-crazed Franks getting over the walls of Jerusalem and just killing and killing and killing until they run out of energy. This is deliberate policy. Baghdad resisted. Baghdad refused to surrender. Baghdad has now been taken, and so it is to be destroyed. We don't know how many people were killed during the sack, which went on for 10 days. The Arabic historians themselves write in very hyperbolic terms. They talk of 1 million people put to the sword. That's unlikely to be true, but it's probably not that far off the truth if you halve the numbers or divide them by 3 or something. They also burned the libraries, or they threw the books into the Tigris. It is said that the Tigris turned black from the ink of all the vast numbers of books that were dumped in the Tigris. And the bodies, the Mongols had to move up. They had to move upwind eventually because the smell of the rotting bodies became overpowering. It wasn't just the massacre and the destruction of buildings and books that was so awful about the Mongol sack of Baghdad. The Mongols also cut all the irrigation canals so that large areas of the Tigris basin flooded. They also destroyed the irrigation system, or if they didn't destroy the irrigation system directly, they killed so many people that the irrigation system couldn't be kept up. In this representation of Baghdad before the sack, you can see that it's surrounded by green fields. After the sack, the irrigation system, an extraordinarily elaborate system, first developed by the Babylonians and kept up and extended ever since, was entirely destroyed, and this whole region reverts to desert within a generation. So Baghdad has been destroyed, its people have been massacred in a number of horrible ways, and the whole region has suddenly turned from a garden into a desert. Oh, and of course the Caliph. He was taken prisoner by the Mongols, and they decided that they would kill him. There are two stories about his death. One is that he was shut into his treasury and allowed to starve to death, surrounded by pretty gold things, which is not very likely because the Mongols seized the treasury. The other story is that they wrapped the Caliph in a blanket and then had him trampled to death by their cavalry. Whatever the case, for the first time in Islamic history, the faithful are without a caliph. I believe they're without a caliph for 3 years. I've dwelt on the sack of Baghdad by the Mongols because it is not an incidental event, it's not an obscure event. This had a shock value that continues to this day. I once spoke to one of my Iraqi colleagues at another university where I was working some years ago. He assured me that if the Mongols hadn't taken Baghdad and destroyed all the libraries, by now his people would have the hydrogen bomb that had got there first. Now, I find this unlikely because probably most of the stuff in the Baghdad libraries was of the greatest importance, but probably not of the utmost scientific importance. But it's beside the point. What matters is not what is true about what was lost. What matters is the perception of loss. This is seen as bringing to an end the golden age of Islamic civilization. It is a loss which is still remembered all over the Islamic world, and it's regarded, I suppose, as the Greeks regard the fall of Constantinople. It's regarded as humanists in the Renaissance saw the fall of Rome. It is all of those things and more. Although the Mongols put most of the population to the sword, they spared the Christians. They spared the Christian community in Baghdad because the leader of the Huns, Hulagu, I'm not quite sure how his name should be pronounced, was the son. His mother was a Christian and his favourite wife was a Christian. Also, the Mongols had a working relationship with some of the Christians in the Levant. There were Christians in his triumphant army in Baghdad. So part of the deal was, or part of the Mongol choice was, kill all the Muslims in Baghdad, but not the Christians. From Baghdad, the Mongols press further and further west. Oh yes, there you are, the Prince of Maya Farakin. He refuses to give in to the Mongols, and so when they capture him, they kill him by making him eat his own flesh. They can do some very wicked things that the Crusaders don't do to them, and things that they don't do to the Crusaders, or rather things that they and the Franks don't do to each other. They and the Franks will massacre each other, but they won't do that to each other, not this kind of deliberate, large-scale atrocity, things done in cold blood. But you see, some of the Franks are in alliance with the Mongols. Bohemond VI of Antioch, he's in a formal alliance with the Mongols, and the Mongols actually double the size of his territory because of the alliance that he makes with them, and he goes to all the other rulers trying to sell the idea of a Mongol alliance. The Mongols are also repeatedly in negotiation with the Pope and the King of France, and they are repeatedly offering all sorts of things as an inducement to the Christians to join in their conquest of the Islamic world. A very important thing. Now, in 1260, you have what the Muslims would call a miracle, but they don't, as far as I can tell, their religion does not rest on the evidence of miracles so much as Christianity does, but they would regard the Battle of Ain Jalut as a miracle. The Sultan of Egypt, Qutuz, he marches out at the head of the last army that can be pulled together. They meet the Mongol invasion head on at Ain Jalut, and they are totally victorious. The Mongol steamroller is turned back. These people are driven out of the region. At first they're driven out and they continue lurking on its borders, ready to come back in. But as with most of these barbarian empires, the whole thing breaks up at the centre eventually, and suddenly a steamroller, a potential army of conquest, or an army of potential conquest, becomes raiding parties which are a continuous nuisance, but always manageable. The Mongol threat is broken at this battle in 1260. It is a miracle. And so Islamic government is re-established throughout the Levant. There is now a difference in how the Franks are regarded. To be fair, and the Arabic historians generally are fair, the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself was very sceptical about the idea of a Mongol alliance. They regard the Mongols as a much worse enemy than any of the Islamic powers. Indeed, when the Sultan of Egypt needs to send an army into Jerusalem, for once he doesn't need to fight his way through Frankish territory. The Franks open their borders. They provide free passage through their territory for the Islamic army coming in from Egypt. They provide all sorts of other support, and they remain friendly neutrals. But after that kind of war, you are less interested in those people who didn't lift a finger against you than in those people who did lift a finger against you. And looking north at Antioch and looking at some of the Frankish and Christian Oriental personnel in the armies of the Mongols, the Muslims find that they no longer regard the Franks in the Holy Land as a mere nuisance. They are now a possibly existential threat. They supported the Mongol invasion, which has brought their entire civilization to its knees. It doesn't help that in 1269 the future Edward I of England turns up in the Holy Land for a crusade of his own, and he makes an immediate alliance with the remaining Mongols. The victorious Sultan, the man who turns back the Mongols at Ain Jalut, he's immediately murdered by one of his generals, Baybars. And Baybars then has to spend several years securing his position as the greatest Islamic ruler in the region. But everyone agrees that when that particular civil war is over, the Franks are next on the list of people to sort out. A question about the nature of the Egyptian Mamelukes. They were descendants of a caste of soldier slaves, but eventually they take over and they rule Egypt for several hundred years. But what matters is that they are the only military force left in the Islamic world. They have to march forth and they defeat the Mongols in a head-on attack, and they put the Mongols into retreat. Once the tide of chaos and bloodshed has receded, one thing that the Islamic powers agree is that the Franks have let them down. If the Franks had thrown their lot in with Islamic powers, if they had said, oh dear, this is a sort of Persian invasion of Greece moment, we must all settle our various differences and fight off this much greater threat, it may well be that there would still be Frankish states or Christian states in the Near East. But it wasn't to be, because the Franks were divided. They were either lukewarm allies or friendly neutrals like the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, or they threw their lot in enthusiastically with the Mongols, hoping that the Islamic powers would then be so smashed up that there'd be no further threat to the holy places. This I think, is what turns matters, and this is what explains what happens next. After the Mongols are kicked out, you've got three strong Islamic leaders. You've got Baybars, Kalawun and Al-Ashraf during a 35-year period. The Islamic world, or at least the part of it that counts as far as the Holy Land is concerned, is now substantially united. They decide to do the same as Saladin did 100 years earlier. They are going to push the Franks out. But it's no longer a case of the Franks are a nuisance, let's get them out of Jerusalem and try and throw them into the sea. This is a question of the Franks are an existential threat. We must remove them from our part of the world. We must make sure that there are none of them left this time, and that there is no way in which they can return. It means that you must capture and you must systematically destroy all of the coastal cities, because with the Byzantines out of the picture, that is where the Crusader armies come from. They come from the sea, they land at places like Tyre and Acre, and all of those places must be destroyed. The whole area must be sealed off so that the Crusaders can never land again. And that is what they do. The whole thing moves very, very quickly. 1265, Caesarea and Arsuf taken. Arsuf, that's where Richard the Lionheart scored his great victory over Saladin. It is a war of great brutality. It is much more brutal even than the First Crusade. And one reason for this, I suggest, is that the Muslims have had a serious fright. And they've learned how to use terror as a deliberate tactic. Truces made were broken, prisoners of war murdered, people given safe conduct suddenly murdered, skulls left piled up as proof of what awaits anyone who resists. It's all stuff learned from the Mongols, I suppose. 1268, the fall of Antioch, the massacre of all the Christians except the richest, and it's possibly the greatest massacre of the entire crusading period, outdoing even the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. Now, it's not a question of, Antioch has been captured, it has a new master. Antioch is levelled, it's obliterated, it's left as a heap of ruins, deliberately. It's not a question of, the street fighting was so great that most of Antioch is now ruined. No, Antioch is taken, its walls are broken down, and all the buildings are destroyed. They're destroyed so thoroughly that the Orthodox and Monophysite patriarchs of Antioch, they move to Damascus because there's nothing left in Antioch. Antioch is the first of the Frankish kingdoms to go, and Antioch itself, the city, is wiped out. It's wiped off the map. After this, there's not much left of the Frankish kingdoms but isolated pockets. And in Acre itself, you have endless feuding, often violent, between the Venetians and the Genoese and the Templars and the Hospitallers. In 1276, Hugh III, king of Jerusalem, he evacuates his court from Acre to Cyprus because Cyprus is safe. 1289, the fall of Tripoli. Again, it's not a question of Tripoli has fallen, it has new masters, but the Venetians can carry on doing trade there. Tripoli is taken amid a general massacre of Christians, and then the city is destroyed. It is systematically levelled. Here is a quotation from one of the Arab historians, Abul Fida. The Sultan beleaguered the city with a large number of catapults, big and small. He enforced a stringent blockade and after a violent struggle took the city by storm on the 27th of April. The Muslim troops forced their way in and the citizens fled to the harbour. A few got to safety on ships, but most of the men were killed and the children taken captive. The Muslims took quantities of booty from the place. When the killing and looting were over, the city on the Sultan's orders was demolished and razed to the ground. So that is the end of Tripoli as a great trading city. Here is Acre. another great historic trading city. 6th of April 1291, the Sultan arrives at Acre with a large army and powerful siege engines. The siege goes on for a month. Very brave defence, but the walls are battered to rubble. Supplies come in from Cyprus because the Franks still control the seas, or at least the Venetians control the seas. Supplies come in from Cyprus, and there is an accelerated evacuation of women and children from Acre to Cyprus. By May 1291, the Templars and Hospitallers, those two orders which have been tearing at each other for generations, they fight side by side in the streets of Acre as the Islamic army pours in, and there is vicious street by street fighting. At last the defenders are driven back to the quays, but that gives time for more civilians to be evacuated to Cyprus. On the 18th of May 1291, Acre is now in Islamic hands. There is a general massacre of the remaining Christian population, and there are barely any slaves for the markets. No prisoners to be taken off to the slave markets. The Templar castle is still holding out, and again civilians are still being embarked onto refugee ships for Cyprus. Terms are offered to the Templars to surrender. The Templars accept these terms, but the terms are broken and the Templars fight their way back into the castle and continue to resist. The same favourable terms are offered the next day. Their leaders go for a conference with the Sultan, as had been done on many occasions in the past, but instead of being offered dates and ginger cordial, their heads are cut off and put on spikes. The remaining Templars decide they'll fight to the bitter end, and they do. And that's it. Acre has fallen, the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In June 1291, the same large army arrives outside Tyre. The garrison's too small, it evacuates to Cyprus. So Tyre, Sidon, Beirut and Haifa, they fall without resistance. Mount Carmel, the monks are slaughtered and the monasteries burned. All of the cities on the coast which are taken are destroyed. Not just their defences, the cities are systematically destroyed and not resettled. By the last quarter of 1291, Cyprus is crowded with scared refugees, and the Franks have been erased from the map of the Holy Land. That's it. The Crusades are over, and they're brought to an end within a decade or so. In Europe, everyone says, we will not allow this to go unavenged. But England and France are getting tooled up for the 100 Years' War. The Central European powers are getting nervous about the progress of the Turks into the Balkans. And of course, when Saladin took Jerusalem in 1187, he didn't take Tyre, he didn't take Antioch. There were various cities dotted along the coast which he didn't take and which could be the staging posts for a Frankish reconquest. But this time all of the coastal cities have been taken, and there's no point trying to take them back because they no longer exist. The cities have been destroyed, their elaborate harbour installations, they've been destroyed. That's it. The Holy Land has been sealed off, it's been cauterized. There is no access from the sea to Jerusalem or from Jerusalem to the sea. And the Crusades are over. That's the end. They end very quickly, don't they? So that's it. There's no long drawn-out story of decline and fall. It's just a sudden eradication of the Frankish presence from the Holy Land. And I think the only way to explain the speed and the ruthlessness with which this was achieved is what happened during the Mongol invasion. As I said, in the 1220s, when Frederick turned up for his crusade, we're not talking about gentlemen who stand up as women and children go by. We're talking about people who are perfectly willing to murder civilians on a large scale in the sack of a city. But at the same time, they're also willing to respect each other as civilized men and do deals with each other and stick by the deals. What happens after the Mongols are driven out is that the willingness to try for coexistence evaporates. That the Franks are not just a nuisance, they're now a threat which must be removed. And so that's the end of the Crusades. 200 years of bloodshed, 200 years of an interesting, if not always admirable, civilization. 200 years in which the Islamic and Christian worlds are united, even if only united in hatred, but they are united. And now an entirely different world is emerging, in which the Christian and Islamic powers will continue to fight, but the front is moving, well, the front has moved from the Holy Land itself to southeastern and central Europe. And the Crusades themselves are never forgotten on either side, but they cease to be a going concern. That's all I have to say, really, about the Crusades. Was that all right?